Right, Mr. Rowe, ready to carry on?
Thank you, sir.
Good, yes.
Mr. Rowe, good afternoon. I wanted just to ask you one or two questions about the contents of GRA 3.2. But to be absolutely clear, it's on the footing that you wouldn't be necessarily familiar with the detailed contents of the document, but the principles in it. Because I understand what you said just before lunch about it being a template for individual fire and rescue services to create their own policies around. Can I start by asking you, please, to look at page 8 internally within the document? It's LFB quadruple 01255.
Yes.
Page 8, that's there. And I want to show you, under construction technique in the middle of the page, do you see in the second paragraph, it says combustible material in voids and cavities and poor quality construction can also contribute to the spread of fire and smoke beyond the compartment of origin. My question is, as a general principle, as at the night of Grenfell, were you aware of that as a risk?
Yes, absolutely.
Did you ever have any training yourself in how to assess the risk of combustible material in voids and cavities and poor quality construction contributing to the spread of fire and smoke?
I've had training about the general principles of building instruction that included passages about the possibility of this occurring.
Right.
But in terms of assessing it, it'd be very difficult to make an assessment of the detail of that from, the externals of a building without knowing how it had been, how it had been built during the construction phase. So the answer is yes, I'm fully aware of the risk, but I wouldn't have had detailed training around how you would then assess it, particularly from our perspective at an incident.
Right. So how would the fire brigade, or any fire brigade, but the LFB in your case, actually go about making any kind of assessment of that risk without some detailed training on what's in front of them?
Well, I think you get some good training about the way that particular materials react. So I'd have an understanding of how a particular material might react, whether it was, for example, wood or plastics or compressed foam or any of a number of materials that might be used in the construction of a building. I would be making a judgment at an incident in the context of what the fire was doing. So, for example, if I can, could I use Grenfell as an example?
Yes, do.
So when I arrived at Grenfell, it was very clear to me that there was an issue with the building that went well beyond the external fascia, because to have had the extent of internal fire spread that I immediately saw, it was very clear to me there must have been voids within the building through which that fire had spread. So that would have immediately led me to believe that there was an issue, possibly due to prior building works or renovations, that had meant that fire compartmentation hadn't been maintained through voids, whether that was through service ducts or whether it was the poor fitting of doors or whether it was of something of an inappropriate nature within the construction. So that's the sort of assessment I would have made, and then I would have had to have made my incident planning based on that assumption. In terms of the specifics of construction, I would have known, again, in the context of Grenfell, I would have known almost immediately through experience and the training I had around high-rise that was concrete slab construction of a certain age. I could see that there was some sort of fascia on it, but I would also know that a lot of those blocks have gone through the Better Homes renovation programme, for example, and that are likely to have had previous renovation works on them, and that actually we had incidents across London in other blocks where those renovations hadn't been completed to an appropriate standard and there had been fire spread. So actually Lacanau is perhaps one example of that. So that it was definitely in my mind, and there's been a variety of training where I've picked up that information, both specifically about high-rise and incidents, but also about building construction.
Right. Okay, we'll come to an example of that shortly, perhaps. But before I leave this document, can I just show you one or two other passages in it? Same sort of theme. Turn to page 16 internally, 18 of the relativity reference. Now, this is part of the way through the passage which starts two pages before, page 14, key control measures, planning. And at the top of the page it says information to be gathered in relation to high-rise incidents should include, and there's a very long list, and 4 bullet points up from the bottom, it says building construction features such as the presence and location of maisonette-style construction, sandwich panels, timber framing, cladding systems, surface-mounted trunking, ducting and voids, in addition to features which present a specific hazards such as asbestos. Now, I should tell you, because you may not know this, that the word phrase cladding systems does not appear in the LFB list, which is Appendix 1 of Policy 633. But so you should have that fairly in mind. But leaving that on one side, were you familiar, as at the time of Grenfell Tower, that it was important or essential for fire and rescue services to gather information pre-incidents about cladding systems?
Not specifically cladding systems, but the premises risk assessment process, which we have embedded within the brigade, is a fundamental part of pre-planning for an incident and preparing crews for what they might face. So no, I wouldn't say specifically about cladding.
Right.
No.
Okay. Do you, while I'm on the point, did you know that the LFB version of this didn't contain the word cladding systems?
No, I didn't.
Right. Right. Did you have any involvement, and I'm straying a little bit, but forgive me, did you have any involvement in drafting or supervising the drafting of Policy 633?
No, I didn't.
Right. Do you... could you then turn on to page 17 internally of this document, which would be 19 of the relativity reference, and it says at the top of the page, contingency plans for particular premises should cover fire spread beyond the compartment of origin and the potential for multiple rescues, and an operational evacuation plan being required in the event the stay put policy becomes untenable. As at the time of Grenfell, were you familiar with the principle that contingency plans for high-rise buildings should contain or cover those things?
Yes, I was, and I think it's covered internally for us in Policy 790, which is the FSG. So whilst it might not be written exactly like that, that policy does refer to the fact that actually as an incident commander you might have to consider the possibility that the stay put advice that, to be frank, works in 99.9% of cases and is proven to keep people safe, might not apply in very extreme circumstances, and you therefore might have to consider a strategy whereby that advice was reversed and consider how you might then manage that incident.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll come to the reversal in due course, because I know there's a lot you can tell us about that. But just looking on this page itself, would you expect incident commanders, as at the time of Grenfell Tower, to be looking out for contingency plans at premises on attendance, which would cover those matters?
I think it's very unlikely that you're going to have a pre-written evacuation plan in the context of a residential block, because it flies in the face of actually the kind of framework that building regulations lay down and our expectations at that building. It would be more that I would expect it to be in the minds of an incident commander that there is the possibility that things can spread beyond the compartment of origin, and therefore you might have to manage an evacuation at any sort of building, actually.
Right.
But in terms of your question about whether I'd expect people to have an understanding that they would need to look at our entry on the premises risk assessment database, yes, I absolutely would. Right.
So does that mean that the entry for the high-rise block on the premises risk assessment would need to be sufficiently detailed so that an incident commander attending the scene would be able to have in mind clearly and accessibly contingency plans covering those two items?
I don't think I would expect our plan to cover an evacuation of the block, because again it flies in the face of national guidance and policy. I would expect them generally as a principle to have that thought in mind.
Right.
I would expect there to be particulars about types of construction if they were likely to pose either a particular challenge to us or they would be of interest to us because that might affect the way the building operated in a fire. Right. Or it might be that it's an interim entry covering a period of renovation, for example, or particular changes to firefighting installations. That's the sort of information I'd expect to see there. Right. In respect to our tactical plan. What I wouldn't expect is, for example, a detailed plan of how you might evacuate a building, because, frankly, how you evacuate a building would be affected by the location of the fire, the nature of fire spread, and the resources you had available to you. I think it'd be very difficult to write something, that would cover all aspects, and therefore there's a danger in that. It's more about understanding the general principle. Right.
On the assumption that the contingency plans would be made by the building owner, would you expect the Fire and Rescue Service, in this case the LFB, to be able easily to have access to those contingency plans?
Yes, I would. I would expect any building which has a premises risk assessment on it. So I'm talking about our own risk assessment on the one hand, but if we're talking about the the responsibility of a building owner under the regulatory reform order to have undertaken a risk assessment and there to be something sufficient there in terms of a contingency plan, yes, I would expect as an incident commander to have that available to me so that I could refer to both sets of information to aid my decision making.
Right. So just taking this incident, does that mean that your expectation would be that when Mike Dowden attended as incident commander first on the night of the incident, he should have been able to access contingency plans such as those in the ORD?
From the ORD, yes, but that's not the same as a contingency plan written by the building owner. So in the context of that high-rise block, I wouldn't have expected a contingency plan to be available from the housing provider. I would have expected sufficient entry on the ORD to enable Mike to formulate a plan with some informed, some information that would help him. Yes, and I expect him to interrogate that. I would expect at some point in the incident to have a detailed set of plans, particularly as time went on and we had the attendance of the local authority there, from the local authority to help us. Yes.
Yeah. Well, again, we keep promising we'll come to things. We will. I promise you we will come back to the plans point in a moment. But just going back to Mike's, what you would expect Mike to be able to do by way of formulating a plan with some information that would help him. Would you expect him to be able to access contingency plans which would cover fire spread, as you see here, in the first bullet point, and an operational evacuation plan?
I would expect him to access information from our ORD that gave him a good understanding of the size of the building, the design of the floor plate, where the fixed installations were, so the things that are going to help him firefight or any officer firefight, whether there was a smoke ventilation system, whether there was anything particular about the layout of the building that might present challenges to us. So that's one of the lessons from Lacanal. So whether it was a scissor block or whether it was maisonettes, whether there was more than one point of access, whether there was a single staircase or whether there was more than one staircase. These are the bits of information that would have helped Mike at that point to formulate a plan, because they would have influenced his tactics to attack the fire and make entry into the building, where the hydrant is, all of those things.
Have you ever had a chance to review the ORD entry for Grenfell Tower as it stood as of June 2017?
Only subsequent to this incident.
Right. You didn't ask for it on the night?
I did ask for it on the night more than once.
Did you see it?
And an officer at the time pulled up the information for me on the command unit and actually briefed me as to what was on it.
Right.
And to be honest with you, I don't think the information that was on it was adequate at the point I was in command of the incident to really give me anything additional that I didn't already know.
Right. Was it adequate at all, did you think?
It wasn't to the standard I would have liked to have seen.
In what respect?
In the sense of the detail held upon it and perhaps the detail of the tactical plan.
Yes.
I can't remember the exact detail of the ORD. I wouldn't be able to give you that detail now. It'd be wrong to suggest that.
But at risk of deviating substantially from my tactical plan, can I just ask you to look at the ORD just briefly? You'll find it. It's in our master documents bundle at tab 13, and it's LFB *03116. There it is. If I could just ask you to turn to page 3. I'm so sorry, page 4. You can see there you can see the words at the top of the page: tactical plan, and then operational contingency plan. Do you see anything on that page, or the next page when we look at it, which would have given Mike Dowden, do you think, full enough information to be able to attack?
It's given Michael some information. So, for example, the hydrant location. I mean, I think it's unhelpful that it says it's a high-rise block of 20 floors, because clearly it's not a high-rise block of 20 floors, it's a block of 24 floors. Again, I think there's some useful detail about the smoke extraction system, the fact it's got a dry rising main, the fact that they've referred to the comms in the sub-basement is useful because that's often an issue for us, and that someone's obviously checked that. I don't think there's a particular issue with the operational hazards, but they're very generic.
Right.
That could be applicable to any number of high-rises throughout London.
Yes.
But there's not a huge amount of detail. No.
Right. Now, we may need to come back to that in due course, so we look at the detail. Just going back to where I was, if I may, going back to the generic risk assessment 3.2, if I can just ask you please to turn on where we were at page 17 internally. Can I ask you to turn on, please, 2 pages to page 19? That's page 21 in the relativity reference. And at the foot of the page, you'll see a paragraph which starts training, which will cover high-rise incidents must include. And this sits within the part of this policy, which is headed training, competence and training. Training which will cover high-rise incidents must include, and there are 2 bullet points. The first is the development of knowledge, skills and understanding for firefighters on the impact of fire on the building's construction, layout, contents and occupant behaviour. Now, just focusing on that first one, did you yourself ever personally receive any training of that kind?
Yes, I think over the years I've received a lot of training of that kind across lots of different packages, not always necessarily referring to high-rise firefighting, but
right.
particularly around the general principles of construction, the importance of understanding a building layout, across all areas of our operational business, whether it's how you might manage hose inside a building or how you might search a building when conducting breathing apparatus operations. You know, the particular challenges of managing, you know, specific contents, for example, you know, a Yankee hazard, an explosive hazard, or the possibility, for example, that we might have oxygen cylinders because people were on medical oxygen in a block. So lots and lots of different training packages which are relevant to build a wide knowledge base as a professional firefighter.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you ever receive training in the context of this bullet point on the impact of fire spread over the exterior facade of a high-rise block?
Yes, I did, in the sense that I'd received the post-Lacanau training package, and obviously that refers quite clearly to the possibility of lateral downwards fire spread, vertical fire spread, the possibility of it moving between the compartment of origin to other compartments, and the possibility that there could be voids within a building that would allow that, and the challenging layout of certain buildings might also enable that.
Right. What was that training?
It was the post, I can't remember the exact title of it, but it was the post-Lacanau incident training package. I think I received that in probably 2014.
Right. And did you train, as part of that training exercise, on how to deal with or extinguish a fire on the exterior above 32 metres?
No, not specifically, no.
Right. So, right, I see. Did any part of that training cover multiple failure of compartments within a high-rise block?
It did to an extent, in that it made it clear that that was a potential risk depending on the building's construction, and that you might be faced with a situation where you couldn't necessarily rely on the extant kind of regulatory framework, I guess, right. That you couldn't always rely on the stay put policy or the protection that compartments normally offer.
Right.
So I think that training package was clear in that, and it made that risk real for firefighters and officers.
Right. Does that, just follow up on that, does that mean that although a firefighter or even an incident commander might normally expect that the building regulations are being complied with, nonetheless they had to be alert to the idea that they might not have been?
I think that, again, I want to answer the question perhaps in a bigger principle, which is I would expect as part of incident command, we use a decision-making model, that you should always make your assessment on the basis of what you see in front of you, and part of that may well be to expect the unexpected. I think you start out with a reasonable set of expectations that building regulations in particular are going to create an environment that is safe as possible for firefighters to operate in and is as safe as possible for people to work and live in, but that obviously, because of human nature, because of the fact that humans are building these buildings, there is always the possibility of error. There is always the possibility that something might not have been done to the correct standard, and therefore the building might react in a different way, and you will have to adjust your plan in that context.
Yes. Sticking with this page, second bullet point,
yep.
Effective call handling and management of any fire survival guidance calls. Did you yourself ever receive any training on effective call handling and management of fire survival guidance calls?
Yes, definitely. And I think particularly post-Lacanau, there was a big push really to review that policy and then, again, go out to officers and station-based crews to disseminate the learning that came from Lacanau, because there was some learning around fire survival guidance that came from Lacanau. Right. So, yes.
And then next page in the GRA, page 20 internally, page 22 of the relativity reference, as the last, four bullets up from the bottom, towards the middle of the page, that the bullet point says evacuation and casualty removal tactics And then it says this: incident commander should understand when a partial or full evacuation strategy might become necessary in a residential building where a stay-put policy is normally in place. My question is, did you, when doing incident command training, ever get any training on how you should make the assessment as to when a full or partial evacuation strategy might become necessary?
No, I haven't, although I am acutely aware that it is in both our high-rise policy, it's implied in our high-rise policy, and is in our fire survival guidance policy, but I've not received specific training as to how I might carry out a partial or full evacuation.
Does it follow from that, Mr. Rowe, that you therefore wouldn't expect a first responding incident commander at an incident to be able to assess or be fully equipped to be able to assess whether a full or partial evacuation would become necessary?
I think that I would expect them to make a reasonable judgment based on their own experience and what they saw in front of them as to whether one was necessary, as to how the building was reacted. Because actually I think there is an element of common sense to this as well, that if things have spread beyond the initial compartment, you're going to have to take a judgment on how far beyond the initial compartment it has spread as to when a partial or full evacuation might be required. So I would have an expectation that people could apply common sense in the context of their experience as to when that might be necessary. But what I wouldn't expect is, for example, a junior officer like Mike Dowden to have taken that decision at Grenfell, because we were talking about something that was on such an exceptional scale and with such profound difficulty that it was almost an impossible decision to take, actually.
Right. Let me...
On a simpler incident, potentially.
Yeah. Let me just see if I can focus a little bit more on that. Can I ask you to look at 633, high-rise firefighting? And I'd like you to go, please, to paragraph... I'm so sorry, I've given you the wrong reference. What I'd like you to look at is 790, which is FSG. And look, please, at paragraph 8.7. And paragraph 8.7, you can see that it says, in exceptional circumstances, an IC may consider informing control that their advice to FSG callers should be altered, for example, to attempt to leave their property. Now, my question on that is, did you ever, or would you ever expect a watch manager to receive training on how to go about making that judgment call, namely altering the advice to FSG callers so that they should now attempt to leave?
Genuinely, I think that is an extremely difficult decision for a junior officer to hold. And I think we haven't provided training that would necessarily equip them for that magnitude of decision, because you're flying completely in the face of national guidance, everything we're taught to understand about buildings. I think that at the point you get to, telling control that people may have to leave their flats contrary to that policy, you're probably at a very significant incident. Because my experience tells me that, well, this is the only incident over a really busy operational career that I've had to attend where we've had to reverse that policy.
Right.
I think that's a very difficult decision for a junior officer to hold. And whilst it's in the policy, I don't think that we've provided specific training that would perhaps allow them to fully explore the possibility of that.
Okay. Do you recall either receiving or delivering training on tall buildings' facades?
No.
Can I show you a document? It's a slideshow, LFB quadruple 03521. It's tab 10 of our master documents bundle. Now, this is an LFB tall buildings facade slideshow. It runs for some 35 pages. It bears the date of the 13th of July 2016, but it in fact was rolled out sometime in October 2016, as we're informed. And it postdates the fire at Shepherd's Court in August 2016, just to give you some background. First question is, have you ever seen this document before?
No, I haven't.
Right. Can I ask you please to turn to page 25? This is the general conclusion. It's not at the end of the document, it's somewhere buried in the middle of it, but this is the general conclusion, and you can see what's stated there. As a general principle, the external envelope of the building should not contribute to the fire spread along the facade. New construction material and method of construction are being used in facades and with a limited understanding of their fire behaviour, stroke performance. There is a need to understand what products are being used in the facade system and their behaviour, and if they are used appropriately and meet the relevant guidance. These could affect the way fires develop and spread in a building. I've read it all out to you because there may be quite a lot to unpick, but in general terms, as at the time of Grenfell Tower, did you understand that new construction material and methods of construction were being used with a limited understanding of their behaviour, fire behaviour and performance?
No.
Right.
I wouldn't have assumed that. I would have assumed that there are challenges around the use of modern methods of construction, because actually the building industry is continuously innovating and developing the way it builds buildings, and I think we're constantly having to learn about new materials and the way they react in fire. But my base assumption would always be that these buildings are being constructed within the framework of building regulations, which have very clear principles about external fire spread. As it says at the top of that slide, a general principle that the facade will not contribute to the fire spread itself, and therefore any new building materials that did come onto the market and were used particularly in the building of residential blocks, I would have assumed had been tested and considered in the context of that framework and that guidance. So no, I wouldn't have gone to a fire expecting it to react the way it did.
No. Were you, although you obviously weren't aware of that principle, were you aware that there was in any event a general need for the LFB in general, an incident commander in particular, to understand what products are being used in the facade system and their behaviour?
I'm not sure that it's possible for a fire officer to maintain that level of detailed construction knowledge, probably to the level of detail you need, because there are so many different products on the market. There's so many different ways of, frankly, putting a building together. It is about being able to trust the building regulation framework, knowing generally how a building is going to react. What I would say, I do expect as a general principle, is that you must always, as an incident commander, and I've said it more than once, expect the unexpected. So it's more about having an open-minded attitude to decision-making when you arrive at an incident, and then intelligently using a decision-making model to unpick what might have happened. If you then have a good understanding of basic material behaviour, so there's only a certain range of materials that anything can be built of, whether it's plastics, whether it's wood, whether it's metal, concrete. All of those materials, you know, most firefighters are going to have an understanding of how they're generally going to react. There may be some specifics, and actually I think there was with Grenfell, which really catch you out. But generally, I would be working on those base principles. If I come to an understanding that there's a certain sort of construction within a building, and I then look at that in the context of what's happening with the fire, even if I don't have specific awareness of that building system, I'm likely to be able to make a professional judgment about the tactics to apply, because I have a good general understanding, I've been trained with a good general understanding of the basic materials and methods of construction.
As part of the unexpected that you would expect an incident commander to expect, would one of those unexpecteds be the unusual development of a fire and its spread because of the particular products being used in the facade?
I think as a general, not necessarily in the facade, but really just as a general principle, I would expect any incident commander to arrive at an incident with an open mind, understanding the principles by which a building would normally operate, because obviously you need people to prepare before they even arrive at the incident with their on-arrival tactics, what I would reasonably expect them to start doing at the start of an incident. So you don't want them to come so open-minded that they deviate from a normal course of action that generally keeps people safe and will properly resolve the incident. But at the same time, they need to be open-minded enough that if that initial plan clearly isn't meeting the needs of the incident, they go back round the decision-making cycle and consider all other particulars. The facade will fall into that, but I wouldn't limit it to the facade. Right. It'd be any aspect of that building's construction. And actually, in the case of Grenfell, one of the first things that I thought was not about the facade, but there must have been significant failure of the internal compartmentation, because the facade alone could not explain what I saw. So I think quite rightly, the questions have been focused on cladding and facade for a lot of this inquiry and the media itself. But actually, I think the bigger story is about how we got to that place of such rapid and catastrophic internal fire spread. And my immediate thought was that something had gone very wrong inside the building as well. It wasn't just about the facade, because it couldn't explain the level of internal fire spread that I was witness to within the timescales with which it had occurred.
Okay. I'm going to come back to this in just a moment. I have to ask you this question, arising out of what you've just said. What was it about about the internal structure which led to that catastrophic failure you've just described?
Well, obviously I can't tell you in detail because I'm not a fire investigator. I haven't been inside the building since the fire. But my assumption as an incident commander when I got there was that, I can only describe what I saw. So when I arrived at the building, I was able to look laterally through the building and see right through compartments and see that flame spread. And although I couldn't see exactly, I judged that it actually had probably breached the lobby as well, because I could just see through the building. So my guess was that, therefore, that was spreading through voids or through a failure of some piece of internal compartmentation. It couldn't just be about the facade. And my guess was that, and that it was a guess, but it was a professional judgment taken on the night, was that perhaps had occurred because of previous renovation works. That would have been my professional judgment at that point. I looked at the block and thought, it's extraordinary the facade has spread like this. That I couldn't believe, because that was utterly exceptional. But I was far more shocked about the level of internal fire spread. So the fact that the facade had, kind of acted as the petrol, as it were, to spread the fire all over the building was one thing. That was obviously genuinely shocking. But it was the complete failure of the building system that caught me by surprise. You might reasonably have judged, if the internal compartmentation was okay, that although the facade had behaved in a way we absolutely wouldn't have expected and shouldn't have perhaps have been allowed, what I wouldn't have expected is the complete failure of the internal compartmentation as well. There would be a degree of that because it was a warm summer's day and windows were open. That was a lesson from Lacanau. I could accept it might have been about the window frames themselves, because again, that was a lesson from Lacanau. I thought about that. But to then see the level of fire spread through the building, I still don't know the reasons for that. So it's just my professional judgment would be there must be some fundamental issues with the internal compartmentation and its maintenance.
Thank you for that. Just going back to this slideshow and ignoring the details, at the time of the Grenfell Tower fire, were you aware that there was an emerging question or issue about the risks of fire spread posed by exterior facade systems?
Yes, although I haven't seen this presentation, as a professional officer at the level I'm at, I want to have an understanding of what's happening elsewhere in the world. Yeah. And I know that there have been fires, I think, in the Middle East and in Europe, and perhaps somewhere on the Indian subcontinent, where there had been a spread of fire through external fascias. But what I was also aware of was that those fires generally hadn't resulted in the complete failure of internal compartmentation I was witness to on the night. It was more about the fact that you could possibly encounter this, but that was really quite close to going to the incident itself.
Right. So you were aware there was an emerging issue based on your knowledge of those fires?
Just professional interest.
Overseas. Right.
Yeah.
I see. But was there any training or any intelligence being shared within the senior LFB community about the risks of fire spread, unexpected fire spread, posed by these systems, these facade systems?
No, there wasn't. I think it was just something I picked up on myself, and I'd seen it and was interested in it.
As at June 2017, had you had any training or experience on how to assess the risk that a fire spreading over the exterior of a high-rise building could break back into the building?
I think that's covered in the Lacanau training package, because I think that package makes it really clear that there is the possibility of vertical, horizontal and downward fire spread where elements of the building fail. So I think, again, it's about a general principle that I would have taken as an officer, and then I can either apply that on a smaller scale or I can apply it on a much larger scale. I have to say, I think it was some of the training within that package that informed some of my decision-making on the night. That understanding that actually, because of the terrible effects of that fire as well, that you couldn't always rely on a building system to react as it possibly should.
Can I ask you to look at that then, and see if we can get it correct? Look at LFB *0003621. And this takes us to the Coroner's Rule 43 recommendations action plan produced by the LFB. This is the first page of it. Are you familiar with this document?
I'm not familiar with this document specifically, no.
Well, let's see how we go. Can I just show you pages 25 to 26, which covers item 19. And the coroner's recommendation is training to be given to incident commanders to enhance their training in relation to the following. And it's then set out. And if you look at the first one, it's use of the dynamic risk management model and other management tools to enable ICs to analyse the situation and to recognise and react quickly to changing circumstances. And then over the page, three is the one I want to focus on. To anticipate that a fire might behave in a manner inconsistent with the compartmentation principle. Did you have any training yourself in how to go about anticipating a behaviour of a fire in that way as an incident commander?
I think I'd refer back to the answer I gave previously, which is yes, I think that's what the post-Lacanau training package gave me. And I also think that was embodied in, and I couldn't give you the details because I've been on quite a lot of them, but I think that was embodied in quite a fair number of the scenarios I received in incident command training. Right. So the incident command exercises, there, was often a scenario presented to you where it had breached one flat or had gone beyond the original compartment into other compartments, just not to the scale of Grenfell. Because again, I think if you had presented that within an incident command exercise, actually, and I'm not being facetious here, I probably would have criticised it as being unrealistic, yes, as that it was very unlikely that we would experience something like that.
No, I understand. And looking at item 6, the collection of information from all possible sources, did you ever receive or deliver training on how an incident commander, such as a watch commander like Mike Dowden, would actually go about collecting information from all possible sources?
I think that's hammered home to us from the start of your officer career. So the decision-making model is very well embedded in the London Fire Brigade. I think it's a really simple model which helps officers calmly come to decisions under great pressure. And actually the officers there that night were under huge pressure. But that is probably one of the first lessons you're given as a crew manager. Or even looking back further beyond that, I remember receiving it as a leading firefighter, as a temporary leading firefighter, my watch officer sitting down and running through the decision-making model for me. And if you follow that model, it forces you into a thought process that tells you you must gather information from all available sources, whether that's building owner, other people on the incident ground, other agencies. It's a doctrine that I think we've embedded really well.
And just following that through, just in general terms, does that mean that you would expect an incident commander, whether it was the first watch commander on scene or whether it was a group manager or DAC who'd taken over incident command, any of them, to sit down and stand up and collate information from within the building and from control and put it all together with a view to forming strategy?
I would, but my caveat on that is that in the early stages, so when an officer turns up in the early stages of an incident, they're in a very different position from me. I personally think that the watch officer, the crew manager's role, that first station manager, I think they're the most difficult roles on the incident ground. I think they're the people under the most severe pressure with probably not enough resources at that point because resources will be en route. They're dealing with the dynamics of a situation, often with distressed people. So they're having to decision-make in that cycle very quickly. So it's not, I wouldn't want it to be portrayed as a slow analytical process. Someone's having to take that process and maybe run through it in seconds in a cycle through their head. And they're almost always at that stage of an incident working on incomplete information and having to make really difficult decisions on the basis of incomplete information. And it's about just building that information over time by going around the cycle. I would absolutely expect them to apply it, but I would want to acknowledge that it's actually in the early stages of a very dynamic incident, and this was the most dynamic incident I've ever attended. It's extremely difficult for junior officers. That is a real challenge. I always look at watch officers and think you have the hardest job, without a doubt.
As a minimum, though, would you expect an incident commander first on the scene to, when collecting information from all possible sources, to collect information he was getting from inside a high-rise block and put it together with what he was seeing on the outside?
As far as it was possible, because again, you're limited somewhat by resources. So it depends where he's going to get that information from, or she's going to get that information from. Have they got people up inside the block far enough to gather that information, or where the source of the fire is? You know, actually, can they reasonably connect what's happening outside to inside? I don't think you come to these things immediately. I think that you're constantly, you know, again, just want to reiterate really that you're constantly making decisions in this cycle. So what your first decision might be is based on incomplete information, may then change later, because both the situation is developing and so is your situational awareness. Hopefully, as more resources arrive, it gives you the space to decision make. So in my position, I think I'm very privileged, because by the time I get there, I've got the time and the space to a degree, not so much at this instant, but generally you've got the time and the space to be more analytical and work more methodically through that process. What's difficult for initial incident commanders, and I would suggest at this incident, in terms of the timing and what I saw of the fire when I turned up, everyone up to DAC level was almost in a watch officer's position. Right. They were in a very, very difficult situation where they were having to go around this cycle, not really having enough information to decision make at the point they're trying to, and not only that, having to take enormous decisions on the basis of very many people's lives in a very short space of time.
Thank you. Can I just turn back then to evacuation and FSGs? Do you need a break?
No, not at all. Sorry.
Okay, all right. First of all, evacuation. Now, you told us a little bit about the difficulty in assessing when it's appropriate to revoke stay put and evacuate fully or partially. Would you, just being specific, ever get training in how to carry out a full or partial evacuation of a high-rise residential block?
No, I haven't, but I think that actually it's quite difficult to provide that training, because you would have to be very careful about laying too prescriptive a plan on evacuation, because particularly with partial evacuation, there may be parts of the building that are safe, parts that aren't. It's going to be very location dependent, and I think that you could overcomplicate something that is in itself relatively simple. You've got to think about who is at the greatest. So in terms of evacuation, what I would expect officers to think about, who is at the greatest risk and therefore needs to leave first? How do I manage it so that we maintain access as well as guaranteeing their egress? And you might have to think about that in the context of a building that's absolutely not designed for mass evacuation. I think it would be very dangerous potentially to try and lay down prescriptive training about how you might carry that out. I think what I would want is officers to think in a common sense way about where the greatest risk was and how we remove the people closest to that risk first in an orderly manner, you know, using our officers to facilitate potentially or other agencies.
And we'll come to that in just a moment. My next question is, did you ever receive or deliver any training in how to prevent or mitigate the effects of smoke logging in exit routes in a high-rise residential block, so as to allow people who did wish to leave or could leave to do so safely?
Not that specifically, but what I have received training in is the possibility of there being smoke logging in the lobby because of the way that we need to run water supply to ensure the safe deployment of our firefighters, so the breaching of a lobby door, and how you would need to take that into consideration, because obviously it's neither in the interest of anyone coming out of the building or ourselves using the lobby to have that happen.
There's that's essentially a built-in compromise of the smoke-proof nature of an exit stair, isn't it?
It is to an extent. I mean, in some buildings you can mitigate that depending on where the riser outlets are, but yes.
Right. Now, I just want to focus on FSGs. I'm going to assume you've had training on FSG policy and how it works. When was the last training, do you think, you had prior to the Grenfell Tower fire on FSGs?
I'm terribly sorry, I can't remember.
All right. Have you ever had training on how, as an incident commander, you would manage multiple FSGs at a single incident?
Yes, I think I've had that over a range of incident command refresher training. But again, I need to set that in a context. So it would have been perhaps up to 10 FSGs, or, you know, the sort of scenarios that were built into incident command exercises wouldn't have pushed it beyond that. I think, in fact, once you get into double figures, it becomes almost a different beast, potentially. And I hadn't received training to do anything on the scale of Grenfell. I mean, I think it's worth reflecting. I think that night we received more FSG calls than we'd received in the previous 10 years. It's just an unbelievable scale, so we'd never train people to that level. What we have done is I've certainly taken part in scenarios where I was required to think about multiple FSGs, how you might prioritise them, and then how you might apply strategy and tactics to the incident to resolve it in that context, yes.
In your experience, what was the highest number of FSG calls you had to deal with as an incident commander at a single incident prior to Grenfell?
In reality, I think possibly two. Two. Yeah, my comment, so I've actually been to quite a number of incidents where there have been fire survival guidance calls in progress, but my general experience is there's normally only one. It's very rare that we would get genuine multiple fire survival guidance calls. You might often at a high-rise get calls from people who would feel that it's a fire survival guidance call, but actually because of the general efficacy of the stay put policy aren't in any danger, can be reassured, and actually we'll be able to get advice to them to stay put, whether we send crews to that floor and tell people to stay in. But generally, in terms of people being at real risk, it being a genuine fire survival guidance call, my experience is it's either one or two at most. So actually prioritisation doesn't become as much of an issue because they're all a priority and we'll have the resources there to effectively commit to resolve that.
Yes. Well, that leads to my next question, which is about prioritisation. Can I ask you please to look at policy 790 again, and this time go please to paragraph 4.2. Which says, the IC, based on their situational awareness and the information provided by control, will decide how to prioritise FSG calls and the actions to be taken on the incident ground. The ICs should direct resources to those callers at greatest risk, high priority, if practicable. Other callers not seen as at greatest risk, medium priority, should be allocated resources when available. Now, just correct me if I'm wrong about this, Mr. Lowe, but it looks from that as if, at least as a matter of policy, this LFB policy did anticipate that there might be situations when FSG calls were so numerous that you would need to prioritise them.
I think it anticipates a situation where you might get more than one, or you might get a number of flats, perhaps on one level or across two floors, where there's been if we're talking about it in the context of high-rise, where there's been a breach of compartmentation. But certainly not in the volume we encountered. It's not designed for that. This policy isn't designed for the volume of calls we received that night. Right. And I think that if you were to talk about prioritisation in the context of Grenfell, I think that's an entirely different matter from the premise set out in this policy.
Even taking a lower number, though, for example, 7, which I think is the number of FSG calls set out on the casualty information sheet attached to the policy, just taking that number, do you know whether there was training available in the LFB as to how a incident commander should go about prioritising even between that number?
Yes, I think that was given at the point where the policy was refreshed and people were updated on the policy, and it would be about, again, taking into context the individual circumstances of the incident, who was at greatest risk, who was the most vulnerable, and prioritising on that basis. It may be that it would be the person highest up the building, so the most difficult to get to. It could be that it was the person closest to the seat of the fire or directly involved in a compartment, in a flat that's involved in the fire. There's a number of variables there, but there would be a way of arriving at that priority, yes.
A number of variables. The factors you mentioned, though, were they the subject matter of training?
I can't remember in that detail, but for me to state that, I would think it must have been delivered in a manner similar to that, yes, that you would think about those different factors, where the individuals were in the building, their individual circumstances. So, for example, if you have a disabled person, an elderly person, a vulnerable person, they might be further up the priority list. If you've got a manageable number of calls and you knew it was going to be difficult to remove that person from the building.
Yes. And would that be something that you would regard as the incident commander's ultimate responsibility, to ensure that prioritisation was happening effectively?
I think it depends on the scale of the incident. So I think if you're in an incident where you've got a relatively small number of FSGs and you've got a very direct link from the incident commander into the tactical sector, then it may well be that they have the time and space within that decision-making cycle to consider that level of prioritisation. I think a larger incident, not necessarily even the size of Grenfell, you would be relying on the sector commander who had responsibility. Well, in fact, you'd be relying on two sector commanders. You'd be relying on the fire sector commander and the fire survival guidance sector commander to communicate with each other to determine priority, because the fire survival guidance commander is going to determine priority on the basis of information received from control to a degree. And the fire sector commander is then going to have to take that information and make a judgment based on what can be rapidly changing circumstances faced by the crews who are doing the firefighting. So the communication between those two sectors is vital. And it may well be that the fire sector commander, because they are committing the crews from the bridgehead, would hold that final decision, actually, in terms of the tactics. And I think that would be entirely reasonable in terms of delegated command.
Yeah. Can I now turn, thank you, can I now turn to the night of the fire and look at some facts of perhaps smaller detail. On the night of the fire, and you say this in your first witness statement in the second paragraph, you were paged, I think, at 1:36 to attend a 25 pump fire at Grenfell Tower.
That's correct.
Yes. And I think you then immediately rang the officer of the watch in the control room. Yes?
Yes, sorry.
So I'm trying to cover this quickly because I think this is...
Yep.
I'm just summarising what's in your statement. When would you normally be paged as an AC?
I would have been paged, actually informed on an 8 pump fire, because you would have had a group manager deployed onto that taking over, you would have had a DAC monitoring, and then I would have been the remote monitoring officer.
Right. And the importance of a remote monitoring officer's role is what? Can you just explain?
It's another check and balance sitting behind the monitoring officer who's obviously deployed to the incident. Right. So you'll be listening to messages, you'll be judging from the messages whether or not the incident is progressing perhaps the way you would expect, i.e. is it growing exponentially, is it contained, is fire surrounded, whatever it might be. And you're providing a voice on the end of the phone to the monitoring officer as well to provide advice and support. So that's the general role of the remote monitoring officer. And also, because you're sitting one stage remote, there's an opportunity, if required, for you to look at the wider brigade picture and tie officers into those lines of support as well.
Before you called the control room, and I appreciate it may not have been very long, had you turned on your airwave radio, or was it on?
No, I rang the control room almost straight away.
Right. Okay. Now, we've got a transcript of that call with the officer of the watch, and it's INQ quintuple 0202, and the call is at 1:38:51, and we can quickly look at the transcript. On page 2, if you just go to that, or be taken to it, it looks like Peter May in the control room.
Yeah, it was Pete May.
Yeah, and you're BM8 for this purpose. And we know that because you go, hello there, it's Bravo Mike 8, Andy Rowe. And then if you just go down the page a little bit, you're told halfway down, Peter May says it's gone up 6, 10, 15, 20, then 25, 30, straight away.
Yep.
And then you ask him about that acceleration. So 25 pump fire now, he says 6, 8, no, it's 6, 8, 10, 15, 20, 25 now. And then he goes on to say, a line or two down, 25 pump fire, we've had loads of people. And then over the page, because I think you interrupt him and say 2 throughs, over the page, trapped in flats, BM8, that's you, loads of people trapped in flats, May, we're talking to them now. And then you go into staffing questions. Now, just at that point, when you're told about the acceleration or the rate of makeup by Peter May and loads of people trapped in flats, what did that tell you in that moment about what was happening?
That I was faced with an absolutely exceptional incident. And I think what this transcript doesn't give you is the background noise in control and actually the level of stress in Pete's voice. Pete's a really experienced officer of the watch, a control officer. I've got a lot of respect for, really decent chap. And for him to, and it wasn't panic, absolutely not. He was, he was in control, but I could hear there was a very considerable level of stress in his voice, which I'd never heard before.
Right.
And I've spoken to Peter on many occasions on the phone to respond to incidents.
Right. Now,
So I felt that I was facing something, even in those few moments, that was absolutely exceptional.
right. Now, on page 4, if we just skip to that, you're told, you're given essentially the informative message
Yeah.
at the top of the page. Residential block of flats, 20 floors, 25 by 25. Fire on flat 4 to 75% alight. High-rise procedure implemented, etc. So he reads it out to you. By the end of that call, what was your thought about the fire spread and the nature of the fire that was being experienced?
On the basis of the information I've received, that the informative at that point was inaccurate, but I wasn't judgmental about that.
No.
That was because I think events had outstripped the officers there, because I felt that surely couldn't, if it had just been a 5-room flat on the 4th floor, 75% alight, that is a very common occurrence, and I would not have expected Pete to have that level of stress. So my sense was that we had a very dynamic incident that had grown exponentially quickly, and therefore it was outstripping officers' ability probably to effectively decision make at that point, certainly to pass effective messages. That control room would be under massive pressure because they must have been handling multiple FSGs, and that actually the best thing for me to do was get in my car and go there,
Right.
because I was going to go anyway and take over, and that actually, if something's developing that rapidly, I guess it was going to carry on developing, and that by getting in the car and then starting to make other phone calls back into the wider brigade machinery, I would start to set in place the framework and conditions that would enable me to take over that incident effectively and sustain it.
Right.
All of my instincts as a professional officer told me I was driving towards a major incident. That would be it, I guess.
Did you have any specific thoughts about compartmentation breach?
Not at that point, because I wouldn't have wanted to work on those assumptions. All I knew is that I had a very, very significant incident with large members of the public involved, and that I would try and gather more information on the way, but I wouldn't have made any assumptions at that point.
Right.
I think about the same time I had been sent some photos, though.
Right. Yes, we'll look at those in a moment, because I want to ask you about those. Is now a convenient moment for a break? To you personally? You're happy to carry on, are you?
I'm happy to carry on.
Mr. Chairman, perhaps we can carry on for another 10 minutes and I can...
Yeah, I was going to
That's the
suggest that, yes.
Now, right, that's very helpful. Looking at page 4 of the transcript, which we've got on the page, on the screen, we've got you asking, if you look a little bit further down, sorry, who's in charge? You say, who's in charge? Have you got any idea who's in charge at the moment so I can make some phone calls? And Peter May says, no, I can't really tell you. And you say, you can't tell me. Just at that point, did it surprise you that Peter couldn't tell you who was incident commander?
No, because I'd gathered already from the early part of the conversation that things were very difficult, but I wasn't pleased about that. No, because my guess was that because control was facing such significant pressure from FSGs,
right.
What I would do, and this is what I would do as a standard piece of process anyway, is I would try and contact the ORT officer that was there, even if they were en route, to ask them to give me a brief as soon as they got there, or I would try and speak to the monitoring officer. So actually knowing the officers in charge was key to me, because they would have been mobilised before me. They're going to have gone there, they're going to have started gathering some sort of situational awareness, and even though I'm driving, you know, I've got the opportunity to provide a bit of support, a bit of guidance, gather some information myself. Ideally, I wouldn't contact the incident commander because they need to have the space to make decisions, but I would like to talk to either the monitoring officer or the ORT officer if I can't get the information from control, because obviously it's better for me to start building my situational awareness en route so I can start to consider how I might best run that incident.
Yes. Now, you ask Peter May, so we've got a group manager actually on it. Yeah, got a group manager. It's group manager Pat Goulbourne. So Pat Goulbourne, is he status 3? And then if we turn the page. You're told he hasn't booked status 2 with us yet. With us, he may well be on the way. And then you're asked to be put the status 2. Did you realise at that point that the incident commander was still a watch manager?
No, I hadn't made any assumptions about that because I didn't know. Again, I don't think it's uncommon to have a change of command and that not immediately be reflected. My hope, and that's why I was asking repeatedly, was that we had someone of a senior rank, either mobile and close to it, or arrived at the incident, who I might be able to gather some situational awareness from and just get an understanding from on the ground, from eyes on, what we were facing as a service, and therefore how we might best deal with it.
Okay. Now, turning to your contemporaneous note, if I can, that's Appendix A, 5405, Paul. You say at 0141, you say, I rang Adrian Fenton, the duty DAC, and asked him to set up BCC. My rationale was that whilst it had not been declared as such, it felt like a major incident, and with it already being a 25-pump fire, would have implications for Pan London LFB resources. What was it about what you'd heard from Peter May that told you this was a major incident, specifically?
I think just professional judgment, a gut feeling of having been a very experienced officer, having attended many incidents, having run major incidents for the London Fire Brigade.
Right.
And the fact that it had escalated in such a short period of time to 25 pumping appliances made me think that we probably weren't going to end there. Right. And the inability of Pete to really give me any really relevant information, it was a professional judgment call. My feeling was that we would set up BCC because actually it wasn't going to hurt anyone. We were going to put officers in somewhere who could start to do some groundwork, to do Pan-London planning around resourcing, media, gathering intelligence, so that we could continue to service the incident, but also run the rest of the London Fire Brigade. If it had been the wrong judgment call, all I would have done was been to have sent some people into Stratford and we could have sent them home again. But I felt I had enough of a gut feeling that it was going that way that I wanted BCC set up and as early as possible so that that framework was in place when I turned up.
Yes, I see. Would you have expected the incident commander at the scene, who was still Mike Dowden at that point, to have declared a major incident?
No, not necessarily. I think, again, whilst we train people to make a judgment about major incident, I would imagine in Mike's mind it was still very much a fire incident, a very large fire. But no, not necessarily. What
did you know, do you think, that made you think that it was a major incident which he didn't know?
Because I think that he probably wouldn't have been aware of the scale of activity inside control, because he would have been inside such a difficult decision-making environment that he just wouldn't have the time or space to have access to that information. I think he hasn't got the experience of running major incidents. He hasn't had the benefit of going on a magic course, and that whilst we would have taught him that an incident of a certain size there should be a consideration around major incident, actually in that moment, in the dynamic phase of the incident, I wouldn't necessarily expect him to. If he did, great. And watch managers do make incidents major incident. The Croydon tram crash, which I was in charge of, the original watch officer, Danny Kelly, made it major incident. But I would suggest that what Mike Dowden faced was so exceptional that I certainly wouldn't necessarily have expected that.
And you mentioned MAGIC, the MAGIC course. That's an acronym.
Apologies, it was the course you referred to earlier, the Multi-Agency Gold Instant Command course.
Okay. And did you, at that stage, you've spoken to Adrian Fenton, did you at that stage think to get hold of anybody at the scene to tell them to declare a major incident?
I think my statement comes to that, actually. So there was a sequence of calls I wanted to follow. I wanted to call Adrian to get the BCC set up, because that was going to help do the planning to resource the incident, because ultimately if you can't resource the incident, we haven't got an operational response. So that was very important to me, the logistics side of it from the beginning. I then ran, I think, the duty AC, because I was AC1, so what we call AC1, and I wanted my colleague Richard Mills, who was on as AC2, to know that he was going to become AC1 and therefore hold the Pan-London picture. And also, because I felt it was going to be a major incident, he should give consideration to whether or not at the point it may or may not get called major incident, that he might have to go into the Special Operations briefing room of the Metropolitan Police. So start think about the Pan-London picture so that I could focus on the detail of resolving that incident.
Right.
So it was about putting the layers in behind.
Right.
My next step after that was to either get hold of Andy O'Loughlin as the DAC going, or one of the ORT officers, to ask them what the situation actually was, because obviously I still didn't have any real situational awareness and just wanted some confirmation as to whether I was over-egging it or actually what I had judged was correct, and we needed to prepare ourselves for a major incident.
Yes, okay. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask a break there, if I can.
Yes,
And can I just say before I do that, that I'm going to come on now to the email that was referred to a moment ago by the witness. We're going to look at that, but I should just say there are some photographs which are attached to it, which some people may find distressing. So, really, for the benefit of those who may find them distressing, I would just tell them that if they want to avert their eyes or perhaps not be present in front of the screens for about 10 minutes or so after maybe 15 minutes after we resume, then that would be sensible. They show photographs of the building on fire on the night.
Yes. Good. Well, thank you for giving that warning.
Right.
We'll have a break now. I think we'll have just over 10 minutes, so come back at 3:25, if you would. And please don't talk to anyone about your evidence when they're out of the room. All right? I'd like to go to the usher. She'll look after you. 3:25 then, please. Right, happy to go on, Mr. Rowe.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ray, thank you for coming back to us. Can I ask you please to look at your contemporaneous notes, page 1, and look at the time mark of 041 still, in the second chunk of which you say, I received some photos by email. You see that?
Yes, I can.
From station manager Gareth Cook at the incident, they showed 100% of one side of a significant sized tower block alight. I sent them to Richard Mills, Adrian Fenton and Keely Foster, the Commissioner's staff officer. Now, I want to show you those photographs. I've given the trigger warning about them. Anyone who's rejoined or joined the room or the live stream and didn't hear my trigger warning, I should just repeat it. And I'm going to show you some photographs of the building on fire. And if anybody finds that distressing, then they should either leave now or avert their eyes. Can I start by asking you to look at the email? It's MET 000016929. And can I just go down to the very bottom of the email to start with? It's the email from Gareth Cook to you, and it's timed at 1:43 a.m. on the 14th of June.
Yes.
And was it to that email that the photographs were attached?
Yes, I believe so.
Right. We'll look at the photographs in just a moment. Just following the email chain up, but the next email up, you send those on. It looks like just sent from scene en route, and this is at 0156 to Andy O'Loughlin, Richard Mills, Adrian Fenton, and Keely Foster, and also Robert Davis. So there was a period of 1:43 to 1:56, 13 minutes or so. Did you send those to them while you were en route?
I'm not sure, to be honest with you, in terms of the timing. It may well have been.
Right. Okay.
But all I knew is that I wanted to send those photos to someone who was going to discuss it with the Commissioner, because she was likely to come out and monitor me, to Tom George, who's Director of Operations, who was the other brigade manager, who would have had an interest.
Right.
Adrian Fenton, because he was running the BCC, and I wanted him to at least share the same understanding I did. Richard Mills, who was obviously then going to become AC1. And actually I sent them to Andy, because I wasn't sure whether Andy was there or not, probably at the point I sent them. So I thought, well, actually, if he's en route, you know, and he's got an opportunity to pick them up, whether just before he stops or if he pulls over and picks them up, that might have been the opportunity for him to gather some situational awareness.
Did you, let's have a look at those photographs, shall we? They're attached to the email, and then I think if you go on in the exhibit, we can see them. Just flip through them. This is the first of those photographs, is it?
Yes.
Okay. And then let's look at the next one.
Yes.
Now, just looking at that picture at the time, what did you observe? Well, let me ask you this way. Did you observe anything from that picture about whether or not this fire had penetrated individual flats?
I couldn't tell from the photo because it wasn't of that size, so it was on, if you wouldn't pardon me, so it was on this phone.
Right.
And it occupied probably just a part of the screen.
I see.
So I was looking at it in very small size, but what I saw concerned me greatly. I couldn't define whether or not there was spread into internal compartmentation, but obviously what I could see was very, very significant external fire spread. And that kind of confirmed my worst fears, really, that we were facing something exceptional.
Right.
I had never seen a tower block alight in that way in this country. I'd seen footage of foreign fires, which resembled it, but not a fire in a tower block in this country, no.
Right.
And my immediate thought, actually, was that there'd been some failure of the regulations. It was quite astonishing to see that photo and think, how on earth has this happened in the context of how we build buildings in this country,
Right.
really?
Let's just look at one or two of them, more of them. So we've got a complete run, so everybody can see them. There's the next one, and then if anything in that picture or any of the following pictures stands out, please tell me. But anything in that picture that stands out?
No, nothing except that it's obvious that it's an extremely well-developed vented fire. So it's not just smoke; it's visible orange flame covering the entire surface of the building, and so therefore, my assumption was that there'd been very significant, very rapid fire spread. I couldn't tell from that whether it had breached internal compartmentation, but whatever had spread, it was significantly alight. You know, I wasn't looking at an isolated column of smoke punching out with some flame, or even just flame at one level. I was looking at significant fire spread up the whole of the side of what looked to be a significant sized tower block.
Can we look at the next picture, please? So same again, I think.
It's very much the same as the first photo you showed me. It's just absolutely extraordinary fire spread.
Yes. Could you tell from the pictures which direction the fire was spreading in?
No, I couldn't.
Okay.
Not from the size of photo I was looking at.
No.
But in a way that was irrelevant at that point. It was just the fact that whatever way it was spreading, it was clearly of a scale that I had not witnessed in a tower block before.
Right. Let's just finish off the run of photographs if we can.
Again, very similar.
Very similar. And the next one? I think that may be it, actually.
I've got to say, I'm not sure I opened all of those either. I think once I'd seen a couple of them, I had enough information really to confirm my worst fears, actually.
Right. Given those pictures and given what you'd been told by Peter May on your call, did you consider the implications for this fire at this point for the residents?
Yes.
What did you think?
I thought that anyone who was inside that building was at very significant risk of potentially losing their life.
Right.
Because regardless of whether it had breached internal compartmentation at that point, you know, if I was lucky, I was going to turn up and find that because of the quality of the photos I was seeing, actually, it was perhaps scrim on scaffolding or a very significant scaffolding fire. I have attended those. They can look really impressive in the early stages because it burns really, you know, fiercely, but it effectively burns away. I thought if I was really lucky that whatever was burning, you know, and I thought it was reasonable at that point to assume it was some sort of facade, again, was going to burn itself out and not penetrate the building. But part of me just had a gut feeling that something was very, very wrong because of the number of fire survival guidance calls as well.
Right, I see. At that stage, did you consider what advice residents who were calling into the control room should be given?
No, and it wouldn't have been appropriate for me too, because I wouldn't have been able to judge what was happening inside that building. So it would actually have been entirely possible that whilst the entire facade was alight, and perhaps it had breached some compartments within the building, it may have been that the central lobby was entirely clear, that the other side of the building, we would have been, you know, right to ensure that residents stayed in their flats. It could even be that people on that side of the building would have been safer in their flats under some circumstances if it hasn't breached compartmentation. So it would have been wrong to try and involve myself in any decision making around that.
Your answer to the last question was that anyone who was inside that building was at very significant risk of potentially losing their life. That was what you said.
That was my gut feeling. That's my honest answer, because when I looked at the photos, that's how I felt.
So on that basis that was your gut feeling, my question was really, did that lead to any thoughts about what advice those people at that risk should be advised?
Yes, but it wasn't something that I was going to consider enacting until I arrived on the incident ground and could make my own decision.
Right.
Because I think it's such a big decision and it's got to be taken in the context of at least sufficient situational awareness to take it, that it would have I think it would have been wrong to try and influence it from a distance as well, because it can only really be taken by that incident commander who's seeing what's happening in front of them in conversation with whoever is in command of the control room and piecing those two bits of information together, really.
Did you have any thoughts at that early stage, and it is an early stage, when you're looking at these photographs and putting them together with the information you've got from control, about how you were going to attack the fire on the exterior of the building that you'd seen?
My thoughts actually, as I drove there, was that with that level of external fire spread, which was clearly right up to the top of the building, I was likely to be less bothered about external fire spread and more about the safety of the residents inside. So my gut feeling was that my focus, and I had started to think about what the incident might encompass, my guess was that my focus was going to be on the residents and not on external firefighting necessarily, because actually, you know, our ability to fight a fire that has spread that significantly externally is relatively limited, because again, we are basing our equipment and tactics on the presumption that you're not going to get external fire spread to that basis. So actually our aerials will operate up to 30 odd metres. They're going to have a throw beyond that of maybe another 2 or 3 floors potentially. So it's unlikely I was going to be able to use an aerial to attack it at that stage of the fire. I was unlikely to put people above the fire to try and get water down onto it. I think I would have been placing them in significant risk to say, for example, put them on the roof and try and get water down it that way. And actually, even from the scale of the fire I could see, my sense was that was going to have to burn itself out we might be able to do something at the lower reaches of the building, but it probably wouldn't be my priority.
Right.
My priority would be making sure that the residents were okay. That was always going to be my priority.
Right. Now, going back to your movements on the night, you say on page 1 of your contemporaneous note that after you sent the photographs, I got in my car. You say, I then got in my car and started to proceed to the incident on blue light. Does that mean that you started to proceed after having sent those, you sent that email on at 1:56?
No, I think I've got to be honest with you. So I've written this on my best guess around timings.
Yeah.
I think I had moved before 1:56 for certain. I can't reasonably explain when I sent that. I genuinely can't. But I obviously sent it at that time because it says 1:56. But I'm sure I moved before then because I live in South East London in Bromley, and it is a long way from Grenfell Tower.
Yes.
And I remember the journey taking roughly 50 odd minutes. So I would presume that I've probably done this perhaps en route.
Right, okay. We have a time of status 2 for you in the short incident log as 1:41:24, and that's at page 14 of that log. I don't need to take you to it. But does that sound about right to you?
I think so, and I think what I would say is that I would have booked status 2 with control, but I was still making phone calls. I was probably, I'd taken the call actually in my toilet, of all places, and I then got myself dressed, had gathered my kit together, including my airwave radio, so it was a bit of messing about to get ready, get out of the house, try and get my mind in gear to run a major incident because I knew I was going to something significant. And I've taken the times from the call log. I know I made those calls because I spoke to those people, but the times have come from the call log.
Yes, I see, okay. You then say on your on page 1 of your contemporaneous note, 1:45 I rang AC Richard Mills, who was AC2, and you said I felt we had what sounded like a major incident on our hands. Were you en route by that stage?
I think I was.
Did you call him on your brigade mobile, or
I
did you have an
I called him on.
radio?
Yes, so it's all on my grade mobile because these times were part of the mobile phone log timings.
Yes.
And I had a look after, when I wrote this statement, I went back onto my own call record on the phone to see.
Right.
But I remember speaking to Richard when I was in the car.
You say you tried to contact DAC O'Loughlin at 1:59, just looking down the page, to confirm his location and situational awareness, and you couldn't get hold of him, I think.
No, but to be fair to Andy, I'm not sure of the timings for when Andy arrived, genuinely. But my thought was, well, actually, this confirms my worst fears, which is I've got a DAC there and he hasn't got the space to pick up the phone to me. And he's either got there before the GMs or, there could be any number of reasons for that.
Yes.
But that didn't make me feel good, no.
Right, okay. In fact, we have an arrival time for him of about 1:55, so...
Well, I'm not surprised at all that Andy didn't pick up the phone.
Now, by that point in time when you attempt to ring Andy O'Loughlin, 1:59, had you heard FSG information over the main scheme radio from control?
I had my airwave on, but because I was making phone calls, really I wasn't taking in the detail of it. And I was already aware that we had a massive FSG calls. Right. Really, at my level, I think it's dangerous to get sucked into the details of some of the individual aspects of an incident because, again, if we're talking about the decision-making cycle, what was important for me and is important to the London Fire Brigade is that I went there with a mindset that I needed to resource this incident, effectively structure the incident, and drive, primary objectives. The only thing that those messages would have given me on airwave in their detail is just more situational awareness about the kind of desperate nature of the incident itself. I wouldn't have been fixated on the detail at all.
Would you have picked up the fact that there were people trapped on the 22nd floor, for example?
I don't remember that point of detail, but I do remember hearing detail passed about FSG calls. I don't remember the detail at all. I just thought that actually we've got a lot of people trapped in this building. That's what I gathered from that as a general sense of what was occurring.
Did that sense extend to getting a feeling, at least, even if not a clear piece of information, that fire had broken back into flats higher up in the building, for example, on the 12th floor?
I feared that, but I wouldn't have thought about a specific floor. I feared that there had obviously been some sort of breach of compartmentation to have so many FSG calls. But again, genuinely, my own approach to incident command is I'm very careful about making assumptions distant from the scene. Really, I want to do the best I can on the information I've got, I wouldn't necessarily assume that, because I have been in a place where, for example, scaffold scrim has been alight, and people inside are going to be very concerned. They're going to look out of their window and see burning scaffolding and scrim. They're as terrified as someone who's got the fire inside their flat. So I wouldn't necessarily have made that assumption. But yeah, there was a fear there. I wouldn't have known it for definite till I got there.
Now, at 2 o'clock, just continuing with your contemporaneous notes, if we can, you say, I rang Group Manager Matt Cook, who was at the scene. He confirmed that there was a very significant fire involving the majority of a 24-storey tower block. I explained that I would be taking over on arrival and asked if they needed to consider making it a major incident. What exactly do you recall telling Group Manager Cook about the progress of the fire? So far as you understood it from what you'd heard on...
It was less about me confirming, it was less about me telling him, it was more about him providing me with a situational update and me confirming my understanding of that.
I see.
And more importantly, on the basis of what he then told me, I was almost certain it was a major incident, and whilst I couldn't take that decision remotely, the detail of that conversation is that I think he was with Richard Welsh at the time. I said, it's not my decision to make this a major incident, but I would suggest very strongly, in light of what you just told me, which was that basically it was a 24-storey block, the majority of which was involved with multiple FSGs, that actually it would be of everyone's benefit to make that a major incident, because it would start the wider scale machinery that sits behind a major incident starting to roll out. Matt agreed with that, and Matt's a good RRT officer, and suggested that he was going to talk to Richard about that. Now, Richard may have come to that decision on his own. I didn't have any interaction before he made it major incident, but I was very reassured when I heard Richard take over, make pumps 40, and then later, not much later, make it major incident.
Right. Did you hear him become incident commander?
Yes. So I heard him on the way. That was something I did hear. So I heard him take over, I heard him make pumps 40, and I heard major incident. All of those things gave me a degree of, I wouldn't want to over-egg this, but a degree of reassurance, because it felt to me that that sounded right in terms of resourcing, in terms of the scale of the incident, and I was glad that someone now of a senior rank had taken over.
Right, okay. Did you wonder where DAC O'Loughlin was, given that you heard that Group Manager Welch was taking over as incident commander?
No, because I actually know where Andy lives, and I know that Andy's got to travel some distance, and it wasn't my assumption that he necessarily got there, or if he had got there, it may well be that, Richard, there was some sort of time lag. Richard had taken over, maybe he was getting a briefing. So no, I would have liked Andy to be in charge, obviously, but I wouldn't have felt particularly that it was unreasonable for him not to be at that point.
Right. Now, just focusing on the conversation you had with Matt Cook at 2 o'clock, did you actually ask him who the incident commander was?
Yes, and I also asked where Andy O'Loughlin was, and he couldn't confirm where he was at that point.
Right. What did Matt Cook, or who did Matt Cook tell you was incident commander?
He told me that Richard Welsh was going to take over as incident commander, so he was clear about that.
Okay. Did you have a conversation with Matt Cook about whether the fire had yet breached into flats?
It was clear from what Matt said to me that he thought there was a degree of internal fire spread.
Right.
But it was a very short conversation because he was under pressure himself. He's and I was conscious that I didn't want to take up too much of his time. I needed enough situational awareness to frame my own thoughts, but not take so much of Matt's time that he wasn't providing advice and guidance and support in his role as an ORT officer to the incident commander, who would desperately have needed it at that point, another officer to bounce off and think about the decision making.
I see. And
so it's a balance.
Yeah. And during that conversation, did you have any discussion about what advice should be given to residents by control?
Absolutely not at that point, no.
Now, once you had discovered that Richard Welch either had taken over or was going to take over, did you think to call him and speak to him about what he should be doing until you arrived?
No. At the point where I understood Richard had taken over, and now having a better understanding of the scale of the incident, I thought the last thing that Richard needed was me to ring him, because I would have wanted him to be taking decisions rather than providing me with a situational update. Yeah. So my preferred route in there would have been via Matt Cook. And in fact, I debated with myself whether or not to call Andy. I can't remember whether I did call Andy again or not off the top of my head. I don't think I did, because I would have wanted them to be making decisions and carrying out activity on the fire ground, whereas Matt, as an ORT officer, has a degree of distance and objectivity because they're in a support and tactical advice and audit role, so they've got the time to take a phone call and join up the dots in terms of situational awareness is a very important part of being an ORT officer. So he would be my route into the incident, particularly because he'd pick the phone up to me.
Right, I see. Turning to page 2 of your contemporaneous note, you can see at the second entry down it says, at 2:07, I rang Matt Cook and he gave me a situational update regarding the scale and rapid off-spread of the fire. I let him know I was about 20 minutes away and that the Commissioner was also en route. In terms of the situational update regarding the scale and rapid spread of the fire, what did he tell you?
I can't remember the exact detail of the conversation, but what I do remember at that point was that he told me it was definitely on two sides of the building. So what I remember is it was on two sides of the building, that it was spreading extremely rapidly. Words to the effect that he'd never seen fire spread like it. It was the most significant fire he'd been at.
Right.
And again, I think I need to reiterate, Matt himself sounded under enormous pressure. You know, and again, he's a good officer, he's a calm officer, he's experienced,
right.
Good incident commander, good RRT officer. I think it's important to state that it's not just the information people give you as an incident commander that informs your situational awareness. It's also the tempo of what you can hear in the background, the sound of people's voices, you know, the way that they communicate with you. They are as important clues, particularly because I would say almost every officer I worked with that night, I knew extremely well, had been on multiple incidents with, had, you know, Richard Welsh, for example, Pat Goldborn, very experienced officers who had been at difficult fires before, special service incidents, calm people who really know how to run an incident. Matt Cook falls into that category. So if I'm hearing Matt Cook on the phone with a heightened degree of emotion and sounding stressed, then I know that something very significant is going on. I think that's important to note as well. It was clear from the tenor of his voice that he didn't have a lot of time to speak to me, and that actually something very significant was occurring.
And again, same question as before. Did the subject of changing stay put or the question of advice to residents crop up during that conversation?
No, it didn't.
Now, you arrived at the scene, and we've got your status 3 time, arrival on scene as 2:31, and that's short incident log at page 14, right at the top. Can I just ask you to be shown that, 2:31:18, just to make sure you've got it in your...
So I think I arrived a couple of minutes before that because I phoned Adrian Fenton at 2:29 on my phone log when I arrived, because I wasn't going to bother control with trying to book in, because my sense was they'd be overwhelmed with calls and I was going to waste my time trying to phone into control to change my status, whereas I knew that Adrian was in the same location as control, because I'd asked him to set up BCC at Stratford fallback, and I just told him I'm arrived and could he just update vision and confirm me as status 3. It probably took him a couple of minutes to walk across the room and do that.
I see. I was going to ask you, you've put in your... If you can just go back to it, it's the second page of your contemporaneous note. The 4th entry down, you do have a time of 2:29 for arriving at scene, parking and ringing Adrian Fenton. Where did you get the time of 02:29 from?
That came off the phone log.
Your personal mobile?
Yeah, so it came off the personal mobile. That's when I phoned Adrian and asked him to put me in.
Okay, and you had already arrived by that stage?
Yeah, so I'd arrived, I got out of the car, that was the first thing I did, because I knew then that was done, everyone would know I'd arrived, and there was some surety that I'd arrived and would be taking over.
Do you think you booked attendance 3 before or after you rang Adrian Fenton?
No, I booked it through Adrian.
Through Adrian?
So I knew Adrian was co-located with control. I didn't want to bother control operators because I felt they were under significant pressure.
Yes.
I knew that he was in there and would simply walk across to the officer of the watch and say, Andy Rowe's now in attendance.
Yes, I see. So you didn't... I see.
It also served a dual purpose, actually, of confirming that I was in attendance to him, because he's an important part of that wider command framework sitting outside the incident.
Right.
And as it says there, I could hear in the background, you know, the volume of calls coming into control. That was quite disturbing in itself, actually.
Now, at the bottom of page 2 of your first witness statement, if we can just go back to that and go to the top of page 3, you say, after arriving and parking, I rigged in my fire gear and began to make my way towards the block. It was 400 metres away and clearly 100% alight on 2 sides at that point.
Yeah.
And then you go on to say, it was difficult to get there due to the very large numbers of people on the street and the traffic congestion. At that point, you arrive, you park, you rig. Did you begin to have a plan in your head about what you should be doing?
I didn't have a plan in terms of a tactical plan, but what I did have was some perhaps expectations about what I might find, i.e. a plan to structure the incident in some kind of way, which I would have expected the officers ahead of me, perhaps taking into account the exceptional nature of this incident, not massively formed, but at least a building block to grow on. I would say at that point, I was in the... So if we go back to that decision-making cycle, you know, I'm fairly institutionalised. I do use that. So I started working my way through it. And in my own head, I was looking at the task event part of the decision-making model. So really, it's just about getting a proper understanding of what I was facing. And that started from the moment I got out of the car, with what I considered to be on the edge of a civil disorder situation, actually. And that's unsurprising, considering the nature of this incident.
Did you go straight to the base of the tower?
I walked past the tower because I could see the tower, and I don't know the area well. I just thought if I head towards the tower, I'm obviously going to find the command unit.
Right.
So I headed towards the tower, which I could see as I got out. I think I'd parked on Bramley Road.
Yes.
And as I was walking there, I encountered more and more groups of people who were clearly distressed, clearly horrified, as you would understand that community would be by what they saw in front of them. People on mobile phones, not anger, but agitation, concern that perhaps things weren't being done. You could hear it in the voice. People were asking me what's happening. Are they going inside the building? Are they rescuing? So people trying to stop me on the way. It was quite difficult to get to the unit, actually.
Yeah.
So there was a number of occasions where groups of people tried to stop me and ask me questions, and I had to politely say, I'm really sorry, I'm making my way to take over this incident. I can't talk to you, I'm afraid.
Did you aim to go to the tower first or to the command unit first?
It wouldn't have mattered to me where I'd gone first, because I would have taken myself to the tower very quickly afterwards to get an understanding of it. As it happened, I walked past the base of the tower and came to what I think is CU7, if I remember rightly, which had the fire survival guidance crews on it. But I came via the base of the tower, and that was very useful to me because it gave me a very clear understanding of probably the first couple of decisions I was going to have to make.
Yes, I see. Okay. Many of those attending had actually come from the southeast of the tower and had passed the command unit first. You'd come from Bramley Road and approached it from the northwest.
Don't ask me how I got to it. I couldn't tell you now, but I came via the tower and then into past CU7, then on to CU8. My journey took me that way.
Right. Now, you say on page 3 of your witness statement, in the second paragraph there, significant debris was falling from it, some pieces being metres wide. The volume of noise was incredible. Along with the sound of falling debris, there were screams of people at the windows trapped in the tower and their relatives and friends shouting up to them. The block was 100% alight from what appeared to be the third floor to the top floor, with fire showing inside many windows. Was that the first time that you knew for sure that the fire had got into the building?
Yes. And I came to that conclusion very quickly, because to me it was very obvious that at that point of the incident, there had been an absolute building system failure.
Right.
I've never seen anything like it. I've never seen such a complete building system failure in my life. It was genuinely shocking. I could look laterally through the building and see that the fire had gone, because I took the time to stop and look for that reason, that I could see it had breached initial compartments into the compartments beyond, and then taking a wider perspective, that the scene, to say it was dynamic would be an understatement. You know, there was a really difficult mix of people not involved directly in the tower at the base, friends, relatives, members of the community, desperate, as you would understand, to have people out of that tower. My own crews and officers doing their best to get people into the tower. That was obvious. It was obvious I had people in there, so that gave me definite pause for thought in the scale of the fire I was seeing and the fact we had people committed. I was immediately concerned about that and firefighter safety. And I was, at the same time, very sure, because I had been thinking about it on the way, that we were no longer going to be able to reasonably advise people they should stay put. That was the first thing that was in my head.
Right. Well, that answers my next question.
Yeah.
Right. And then the second question, my second question, is: did you still think that fighting the fire was a viable option?
No. The only reason we were going to be fighting that fire was to maintain the conditions in which we could put BA crews as far as we could to mitigate the risk to them. And I have to say, I think at times we went beyond what is acceptable to put a firefighter into. I should be clear about that as incident commander and hold that decision. I think we were, right from the very start of that job, on the absolute margins of what's acceptable to commit a firefighter into. Right. And my sense was that we could no longer, in the same way, focus on fighting the fire, we had to really focus on getting everyone out of that building. That was my absolute priority. The building was gone. There had been a complete building system failure. The facade was entirely alight. Every window I could see, there had been a breach of compartmentation. There was no viable way of saving that building. I can't talk about the detail of everything inside the building, but as a general principle, I was very clear that all our efforts had to be about, and I'm talking almost instantly, had to be about putting the maximum amount of people with breathing apparatus into that building and making the maximum effort to take as many people out over as quick a period of time as we could.
Did you, at that moment, or even later, but focusing on that moment for the time being, did you stop and ask yourself, what is the mechanism of internal fire spread to this degree in this building?
Yes. And my only thought was that it was going to be a combination of things. It was going to be a combination of whatever was alight on the outside, allowing fire to spread across the external surface in a way that was, unbelievable. But then there must have been a failure, perhaps through renovation, or because a combination of renovation, open windows because of the time of year, perhaps again because of the training I'd got from the Lacanau house package, whether the window system itself had failed, so it was dripping plastic and spreading. There was all sorts of things in my head, if I'm honest. Went through it very quickly. But I just considered there would be a whole set of variables which could have led to that failure of, internal compartmentation. But that scale of failure must have been very, very, very significant because it was every single floor. Every single floor I could see where there was flame on the outside, the impression I got very quickly was that there was significant internal fire spread as well.
And did you have any thoughts or even suspicions about what the cause or causes of that internal fire spread were?
No, I would have been working on the general assumption that they would have been spreading through voids. It would have been all the things that make a fire spread under any circumstances, which is a route to travel. So it was clear to me that whatever way you looked at it, to put it in layperson's terms, you had an accelerant on the outside, and it felt to me like the building was punched full of holes. It was like a cheese grater, in the sense that there must have been a route for that fire, because it's the only way you can explain that in a concrete building. The concrete's not going to burn in that way. The window system shouldn't fail in that way, but perhaps there'd been open windows. The facade definitely shouldn't burn in that way, but therefore there's got to be an element of combustible material or a route for fire through that building that cannot be readily explained by the concrete structure. So it had to be through voids or through material in those voids that enabled that fire spread, or because there wasn't any compartmentation, because doors were open, because there was lots of people there. There's so many variables that could have led to that internal fire spread, but in a way, without wanting to sound crass, it was almost irrelevant at that point, because I had what I had. I had a building that had failed completely. There was massive internal spread. Therefore, what I was faced with was how I was going to get as many residents out of that block in as short a time as possible, keeping my firefighters as safe as possible. They were my priorities. That was it. In many ways, I didn't really need to know why it happened, because I wasn't going to attempt to extinguish that fire. I was only going to attempt to create the conditions by which we could rescue people and control the fire, at least to an extent internally, where I could commit crews.
Now, we're going to come to your takeover of command in due course. Before we do that, just to tell you where we're going to go first to CU7 and then to CU8.
Yeah.
On page 3 of your witness statement, you say in the third paragraph that near the base of the tower I came to the first command unit, CU7. On it I found Group Manager Tom Goodall and a CU crew of 3 watch managers. I didn't know them, but I recognised them. And then you go on to say, 3 lines down, he briefed me that he was responsible for fire survival guidance, FSG. I asked him how many FSG entries he had in total, but at that point he was unable to tell me, as they were adding to them constantly. His estimation of the number of people who had called to say they were trapped was over 100. And then you say, I was more than happy with the system they had in place. I asked that they take photographs of the board as it changed, so we maintained a record, and praised them on their work. I then left for CU8. Now, I've read that all to you because I just want to unpack that a little bit with you if I can. Did Group Manager Goodall tell you how he was handling the FSGs?
Yeah, I was very clear about the system employed. So basically, he had a number of watch managers. So he had someone answering the phone. That information was then passed to another watch manager, and they had a grid up with loads and loads and loads of lines, which they were filling information into of where residents were located. That information was then inscribed onto one of our FSG sheets. That sheet went from the unit into the base of the tower via a runner. There was then someone inside, and I can't remember who. At that point, I can't remember who it was when he briefed me, but there was an officer inside who was then making sure that information was passed, on my understanding at that time, to the bridgehead. So any crews committed would be committed on the basis of having an individual task to complete. So that was how the passage of information was going to get into the tower, and I was satisfied with that. I think happy is the wrong word.
Right.
You have to apologise to me, because I think happy is not how I would describe it.
No,
I was entirely satisfied that he was doing his best. I think what I should also reflect is that Tom is an officer I've worked with for many years. He ran the fire policy team. Again, he's a very experienced operational officer. I trusted him, and I was going to have to trust him to effectively command that incident.
Sure. Can I take you to your contemporaneous notes at page 2, where you describe that briefing in perhaps a little bit more detail, and pick up the sentence in the fifth line, where you say, recording the fire survival calls sent to him by control, passing the locations of trapped persons on to an SM in the tower, who was then briefing BA crews directly. Did he tell you that it was a station manager in the tower actually providing their deployments to breathing apparatus crews?
From what I remember, he just said that there was an officer in the tower, one of whom was definitely a station manager. I think he had more than. He told me there was more than one officer in the tower.
Right.
And that BA crews were being briefed as to the fire survival guidance calls, and then obviously committed via the bridgehead. And my expectation, because that's our policy, is that there would be a direct form of communication between the bridgehead and whoever is handling and briefing those crews in respect to fire survival guidance. It's got to be a continuous process.
Yes. Would you expect the bridgehead to be doing the briefing, or would you expect the bridgehead simply to be doing the deployment, with the briefing coming from somebody higher up or lower down, the chain of communication, depending on how you look at it?
I think it could happen either way. I think it's about what works for that incident. What is vital is that there is a consistent communication between the bridgehead and whoever is briefing people for FSG,
right.
Whether that's at the bridgehead itself or whether it's happening prior to the bridgehead. It would just be about whoever's in charge of the bridgehead having a clear understanding of the route in for FSG information, having a clear line of communication to whoever is running FSG, because the two sectors are symbiotic. They have to work together. So I wouldn't be kind of doctrinally fixed on what was the right way to do it. It would be how experienced officers work together to ensure there was a clear system to get that information out of that command unit into the tower, into the crews going to the bridgehead. That would be what I would expect. And actually it should be down to them to design and operate that system. I think it's my role to maintain progress and validate whether the system was working.
Right. So would that mean that where the watch manager in possession of the FSG information was giving a brief to a BA crew, and then that brief was being overridden or changed by the bridgehead?
I don't think there's necessarily an issue with that, as long as there's a return of information, because the bridgehead is having to act on sometimes what can be very rapidly changing information. So perhaps I can give a hypothetical example. If you were given a flat to get to rescue someone, but the fire conditions have changed between the time where and I think that's entirely possible in the context of this incident, between the time you'd received the information to the point you got the bridgehead, then actually it's very possible the bridgehead would say, actually, we think on the basis of information we've got, we might need you to do something else. What it would then need to happen, though, is that there was a return of information. Right. Now, again, to set this in a context, that's your ideal world. In the scale of this incident, that would have been extremely difficult. Whatever system was employed, the volume of information, the turnover of BA crews, this is the largest, I've now learned post-incident, the largest breathing apparatus ever carried out in the history of firefighting. So just the volume of committal of BA crews, the turnover. And again, I think something that perhaps hasn't been talked about previously is the psychology of the crews committing. So obviously the information loop is closed by the people who are undertaking the tasks, is closed by the officers who are undertaking the briefing and committing. What I can tell you, and I'm sure we'll come to it, is when I went into the tower, what I became acutely aware of is that we were committing people into the most extreme firefighting circumstances I'd ever seen, and people were scared. And that's going to affect their decision making, and it's going to affect their ability to communicate. I was also seeing firefighters coming out of there exhausted, carrying casualties, and again, I remember thinking on the night, this is going to affect the information I receive back. I'm not necessarily always going to be able to hold people to the level of information I want. It was that sort of incident where something was moving the whole time. So my priority came in the end to be about volume, because my reasoning was that as long as I ensured a continuous volume of breathing apparatus whereas inside that tower, whilst we were not always necessarily going to be able to prioritise on the basis of risk, because actually everyone was at risk, and I think because of the volume of calls, it would have been almost impossible to determine that priority for those officers involved. What I had to do was flood it with a volume of BA wearers to such an extent that there was continuous operation to give us the best chance of getting people out. I think that was the scenario we found ourselves in.
Can I then just pick out from that answer, long answer, not being critical.
Apologies.
No, not being critical. It's just, there's a lot in it, and I need to be clear that I follow things up. Can I just discuss with you then a little bit about the return of information from the bridgehead through CU7, which was the FSG sector? Did you check during your discussion, your first discussion with Tom Goodall, if he was receiving back from the bridgehead any information about the outcome of particular deployments in response to particular FSGs?
I can't remember the exact date of the conversation. I don't remember if I had it then or later. I'd have to look at the notes. But I do remember having a conversation with Tom where he articulated that he was finding it very difficult to get information back, and that actually he just didn't have the space or the time to pass that information back into control to the degree he'd like to have done. And the other thing he reflected on in that conversation, because I do remember the conversation, is that it was very difficult because people were moving flats as well. So it wasn't even that people were staying in one location. There was no surety that where someone had originally phoned from and said they were going to end up, because he was aware, and he told me more than once, that people were moving between flat locations. So I think the ability to pin that information down, both in the nature of the volume of calls, the extremity of the internal firefighting conditions, the continuously changing nature of those conditions. So at one moment, one floor, it would be sustainable to have firefighting operations on, the next minute it wouldn't be. Yeah. Just meant that return of information was enormously difficult. I know that all through that incident, as incident commander, I was never satisfied at the return of information about the number of people we brought out. So I think the recorded level of rescues, and I sent people out specifically for that task, is 65. I know full well that we rescued far more people in that. I think from what I've been told, the CCTV evidence alone shows that. But in terms of actually being able to gather that information from crews who were traumatised, who were tired, who were coming past officers who themselves were tired, we just never got to the bottom of that.
Can I just ask you to look at the PRC notes, which is LFB 0003112. Now, I don't know whether you've ever seen this document before, Mr. Rowe. We've been working on this. This is a handwritten record of a PRC meeting of the 3rd of July 2017, at which you and the other incident commanders, I think, were present. Yeah. Do you recall that meeting in general terms?
Yes, very much so.
There was a logist there, or somebody writing down what people were saying. Can I ask you to turn to page 12, please? And it's the top quarter of the page, actually, where it says Tom Goodall.
Yeah.
Do you remember a discussion between you and Tom Goodall at this meeting about passing information back?
Yeah, absolutely. Because if the point of a performance review of command is to honestly examine your own decision making in an incident, to take learning forward for individuals in the organisation. Yeah. And if you were to ask me in hindsight, an area that I would like to have improved on, it would have been that return of information. I think very, very difficult in a contact
Okay,
sense.
as you say, Tom Goodall at this meeting says, in hindsight, didn't really pass much info back to control, but we were overwhelmed. And you say, in hindsight, I should have ensured info was passed back to control.
I mean, that's Tom's notes, but I wouldn't know if I've expressed it exactly like that.
But it's not, no, they're not Tom's notes, to be clear. These are the logist's notes of what was said at the meeting.
Okay.
So, I mean, my first question, I suppose, is, do you remember saying that at the meeting?
I remember saying something similar, which is I didn't feel it was right for Tom to just hold that responsibility, because whilst he had that delegated command to run the FSG sector, actually I was the overall incident commander,
right.
And I was aware, and I think you'll see from my own decision log, I was chasing that information much more frequently further into the incident, and found it very frustrating actually that we couldn't get that information back.
Right.
If I was asked honestly, and I think those processes are very important for us to take learning forward, there was an area of the structure and command that I would like to have done more efficiently. It would have been that return. Doesn't necessarily mean we would have achieved that, because actually the volume of information, the dynamics of the incident, the terrible pressure that officers and crews were under meant that gathering that information was at best very difficult.
My question, sorry, having shown you that, when you say in hindsight, I should have ensured information was passed back to control, my question is, what would you have done to ensure that information was passed back to control?
I think I could have gone back to Tom more regularly about that specific point,
right.
I guess. We could have considered perhaps some sort of additional layer to the system, but actually I think in terms of taking learning forward, it'd be more about a general principle I would take into another incident, and I would think about a structure appropriate to that incident. You know, I think it's quite difficult to see how we would have done the incident differently on the scale of that particular incident.
Right.
But it was just an honest reflection that I didn't want Tom. I felt that Tom had been honest in the PRC there, that he knew that he hadn't passed perhaps as much information as he would have wanted. I'm not sure actually he'd have had the capacity to. And I felt that it wasn't just his responsibility to hold that. I was the incident commander. I'm ultimately responsible for helping close that loop. Truthfully, I'm not sure that would have made a lot of difference to the operations within the tower, though, because I don't think we were in a position, because of the volume of calls and the dynamic nature of the incident, to keep on bringing that information back out of control to that level of change into the incident ground, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Does that mean, well, let me ask you this way. Are you familiar with the provisions of paragraph 9 of FSG policy 790? I'll show it to you if you like. It's about.
It would be helpful if you do, because I can't remember the exact paragraph.
Right. Even
Apologies.
You aren't able to remember them off by heart. This is about. Well, if you go to that, it's 790, tab 5 of our policy bundle. Paragraph 9.1 says, it's vital that control is kept informed of the actions being taken to resolve each FSG call. The fact that control is aware of the actions being carried out on the incident ground will greatly enhance the advice given to FSG callers. Now, just pausing there, first of all, were you aware of that policy requirement?
Yeah, absolutely. The closing of that loop is a very important part of FSG.
The second question is, what efforts did you make, if any, to do your best to ensure that control was kept informed to resolve each FSG call, so far as you could see?
I reminded Tom of that in the conversations we had, but whilst at that incident, my sense was that those officers who were handling FSG calls and the volume of information coming in were working at absolute capacity, and then to pass the information back, you know, I would like the loop closed, of course I would, because I think it's useful, but I had a concern about capacity on both sides. So not only were people changing locations, the fire conditions were changing so rapidly all the time internally. There was a real danger actually of providing advice on the basis of, so say for example, we told them a crew was coming, a crew's going to be with you soon, we've committed a crew, and then that crew is deviated in the moment. Obviously that information is correct. So I think it was just the scale of it was at times almost overwhelming for those officers, and closing the loop was just very, very difficult. What I think would have been helpful would have been to update control perhaps more on the overall return. So how many, maybe even just numbers. And I think that did happen a couple of times across the night. So we told them how many people we thought we had out. And I know that Tom at times tried to pass some information back. But I think it was such a volume and changing so rapidly that was very, very difficult because they were constantly taking that information. But if you're talking about an aspiration, which is what learning is about, and trying to do your absolute best, then I would hold by the point made in the PRC is that we would always want to try and close that loop.
Right. And then 9.3, while we're on it, the outcome of every FSG call must be communicated to control. And my question is, was that possible?
No, absolutely not in the context of that incident. There was no possibility of communicating the outcome of every call for a variety of reasons. Number one, it wasn't clear necessarily what flat number you were going to at times, because that information was, deteriorating by the moment because of the firefighting conditions. People had moved flats. The people you were rescuing were invariably extremely distressed and actually probably weren't going to give breathing apparatus crews particularly accurate information. The crews themselves are wearing breathing apparatus, which is not ideal to communicate in terms of speech. There's so many things there that might affect the outcome of an FSG call that no, I think it would have been absolutely impossible when combined with the volume of calls and the fact that the people we were bringing out of there were often themselves incapacitated. We were working quite often with a deficiency of valid information throughout the entire incident.
During your briefing, that initial briefing with Tom Goodall on CU7, did you ask him how he was prioritising between FSG calls?
I don't know if I stated it exactly like that, but I did ask how we were determining how crews would be committed. Again, my immediate impression was that my focus shouldn't be on that, because the volume of calls would have meant it was almost, I felt from the start that the volume of calls would make it almost impossible to prioritise on an individual basis unless there were some really extreme examples of someone who everyone needed immediate rescue for a start. But I felt that for them to go through that process continuously, faced with the volume of calls they had, actually might have slowed down the process of getting crews committed. I was more interested in getting a volume of crews in, because that in the end was what was going to get those people rescued. And because of the level of internal compartmentation fire spread I'd seen, my judgment was that it would be very difficult to pick who was at greater or lesser risk within that building. I think anyone who was caught up within that incident, by the time I'd got on the unit to take over, I'd come to the conclusion they were all at very great risk, and therefore our focus should be on that broad approach that we just commit as many people as possible and we don't stop committing them until we've got as many people as we can out.
Did you discuss with Tom Goodall the importance of getting to elderly people or children or people with mobility issues as a prioritisation
No,
factor?
I didn't, because I felt that we were well beyond that stage at the incident. Right. My sense was that if we'd started to try and extrapolate that information, they would have been caught in a level of detail that was not going to help us. What I really needed was them to confirm broadly location and someone needing rescue. Right. That's what I really wanted Tom to do. I wanted a crew to get as soon as possible where a flat was with someone in it, and then put a volume of crews through, because that was the most efficient way time-wise to ensure that we had the maximum amount of people committed in and a turnaround of crews to keep on pulling people out of the building.
Now, we know, because we've heard from Tom Goodall and seen some photographs, that he did in fact put in place a system of prioritisation. And the earliest photograph of the checkerboard we have where he did that was about sometime between 3:15 and 4 a.m. Did there come a time when you discovered that he had in fact attempted at least to put a system?
I was aware that he was prioritising,
right,
but it was to exception. So I think he had red Ps.
Yes, he did.
From what I remember, I don't remember all the detail of it, because you've got to remember I'm responsible for the whole incident and I'm taking a snapshot at each part of the incident I'm going to look at to kind of validate my own sense of whether things are working as best they can. I remember there being red Ps, which I took to be prioritisation of an individual for whatever reason. I wouldn't have wanted to break down the individual detail of those. It would have sucked me into a level of detail I didn't need to consider. But I was satisfied that he did have a system for prioritising to exception. But again, I wasn't obsessed with that. That wasn't my priority.
Sorry. Did you take any steps to find out how Tom Goodall, or indeed anybody at the bridgehead or in the building, if not at the bridgehead, was capturing information from residents who had been rescued or had self-evacuated?
Yes, I mean, that was not... I didn't feel good about that, actually. But I thought there was very little that the crews could do. So I came across a watch manager, who I now understand, I think it was Glyn Williams from Soho. So when I went into the tower, to try and give myself some assurance about the control of BA crews internally,
Yes.
it was clear that we were transferring FSG information onto a wall, which is actually what had happened at Lacanau and why we'd brought in the fib board system. But again, I think it tells you the story about this incident, that we'd had this extremely tragic incident at Lacanau where we recognised that the systems we did have, so incident command wallets, the recording systems we had prior to Lacanau weren't of a size or sufficient to capture a number of FSGs. We'd then designed, implemented and delivered a system to to counter that, we thought, to our satisfaction as an organisation. So fib boards are large. To find that we had run out of space on the forward information boards and multiple forward information boards, and we're now once again in the situation of having to write on walls, was a horrifying thing for me to see. I mean, it just told me all I needed to know about the incident. The system, the very system we'd put in place to manage multiple FSGs had now failed because of the volume of FSGs we were encountering.
Right. Going to your second witness statement, if I can, looking at page 5, you say, I think, 3/4 of the way down that page, one of the first questions I asked at the scene was whether we had any tactical plans for Grenfell Tower that were relevant on our system. The answer was not really of any significance. My first question is did you ask that question on CU7, or was that a question you asked when you got to CU8?
CU8.
Right.
And I can't remember his name, I knew the watch officer, I trusted him. He said that there was very limited information on it. It was just about the size of the building and that they got that wrong.
Right.
So I decided at that point I wasn't going to waste my time looking at information that probably wasn't correct, didn't contain. The one question I did ask was whether there was any sort of floor plan of any significance. He said there wasn't. So that was enough for me at that point. I had other things to concentrate on.
Yes, I see. Okay, so that's a CU8 question. You don't remember who the watch manager was you asked?
I'm afraid I don't know.
All right. Well, let's go to your arrival on CU8. When you arrived on CU8, did you immediately order a radio announcement that you were incident commander?
Yes, that was one of the first things I said. I just got on and said, I'll be taking this incident
Right.
over. Could you let the fireground know that I've become the incident commander, and could you let control that I've become the incident commander?
Okay. And who did you give that instruction to?
To one of the control unit operators.
Do you know who that was?
No.
Okay. Now we've
But I
got
addressed them directly and they confirmed they were going to do it.
Okay. Right. We've got a timestamp for that of 0244, and that's page 23 of the short incident log. I don't need to take you to it, but at 0244, well, there it is. Informative, CU8, AC Rose, now IC. To the best of your recollection, is that around the time you think you arrived on CU8?
I would say so, give or take a couple of minutes perhaps before. Yeah.
Right, okay. Did you notice or know that 2 minutes before, Andy O'Loughlin, who was in command at that stage, had received information or put out an informative that 58 adults and 16 children were believed involved?
Yes, because I think I was on the unit at that point when that went, so I think I heard the informative go.
Right.
So I was very aware at that point of the sort of numbers we thought might be involved.
Right. Now, turning back to your first witness statement at page 4, you say in the second paragraph on that page, at 2:44, I told DAC Andy O'Loughlin, Group Manager Steve West, Station Manager Jackie McConaughey, and a CU crew of 3, whom I didn't know by name, but only by sight, that I was taking over with immediate effect. This was communicated over the radio. And then you go on to say, and halfway down that paragraph, Andy, who had taken over for a short time, gave me a brief. And then you go on to say, he confirmed that Grenfell was alight from the 3rd floor to the 24th floor with multiple people trapped inside. But Richard Welch and Pat Goulburn had fire sector, which encompassed the entire building. Dave O'Neill, safety sector, and asked for BA main control to be set up in front of the leisure centre opposite the block. We had BA crews rigged in the block who were progressing rescue efforts well up into the building. Did Andy O'Loughlin tell you anything about whether the fire had penetrated into flats from his point of view?
At that point, I think I'd communicated that. So I don't think we had that discussion. I think there's a general understanding that we'd face in building system failure. I don't remember that piece of detail. What I do remember is that Andy gave me a really good brief about the structure he put in place, what he thought our priorities were in terms of objectives, which wasn't to firefight, it was to rescue, and that he talked about how he was going to ensure a supply of BA wearers into the tower. So the fact that BA main control had been set up, that Pat and Richard were effectively sharing responsibility for the fire sector. Obviously, I knew Tom was already running the fire survival guidance sector, and I felt assured actually by Andy's plan. he'd clearly thought about a structure that was likely to work moving forward.
Right. Did he tell you what his strategy was?
His strategy was broadly along the same lines of thought as me, which was to focus on rescue, get as many people as possible inside the building, as high as we could, and basically flood the building with BA to get people into the flats, to get residents out.
Right.
That's as much as I remember from that in terms of broad strategy, which I know sounds very simple, but in many ways Grenfell, for all its horror and its complexity and its dynamism, was quite a simple incident. It was a whole building alight, and we knew what we had to do.
Now, he hadn't revoked the stay put at that stage.
No.
And we're going to come to that decision in a moment. Did he tell you that he hadn't had any information back from the fire sector or the FSG sector for the previous 25 minutes or so?
No.
Despite his efforts to get some?
No, he didn't at that point.
Did he give you any FSG numbers?
I remember having a discussion about FSG numbers, but not the detail of it. And I think I probably reflected the fact that even from the last time he checked, that those numbers were rapidly rising. So I think there was something along the lines of me reflecting what Tom Goodall had said to me, because obviously I was getting onto the back of the unit, knowing that there might be perhaps 100. That they were the sort of numbers that Tom had talked about.
Yes.
But I wanted that brief done as quickly as possible. So to an extent, I was controlling the brief. I already had some situational awareness. I needed to know what Andy's structure was so that I could take over effectively as quickly as possible. And so I would know what officers I had were responsible for different parts of that kind of delegated command structure.
Yeah.
So that was my priority. Once I knew that his primary objectives were in line with my own assessment of it, I didn't really want to pull that all apart. I needed him out there really acting in the role of operations commander. I knew I was going to need one of those because of the scope and the scale of the incident.
So did you note the discrepancy between what Tom Goodall had told you about persons trapped, 100, and what you got from Andy O'Loughlin, which was 58 adults and 16 children?
I can't remember markedly noting it in the conversation. I do remember thinking it when I heard the informative, but I put it down to the fact that actually what that told me is that we were getting a continuous stream of fire survival guidance calls, and this incident was, just so rapid in its development that I might have to look well beyond it. In fact, I remember the thought I actually had was that this is a block, my own estimate, so I've done a quick bit of mental arithmetic walking in, could contain 450 people, maybe. I knew that it was Eid, and that we had a significant Muslim population in that community, so my expectation would have been that families would have been there and celebrating. So I thought that figure could have been inflated. I was less concerned about the discrepancy between 100 and whatever Andy thought it was, and the possibility that there were actually far greater numbers of people involved, potentially, because of the time in the morning that the fire had occurred. And obviously at that point, in terms of my situational awareness, I had absolutely no idea of how many people had managed to escape the building before the fire had spread to the extent it had.
Right. At that stage, did you know that there was only one staircase in the building?
Yes, I can't tell you where I got that information from, but I know that when I got onto the unit, I was well aware that we weren't using the firefighting lift and that there was only one staircase.
Right.
Someone had told me that, and I passed a number of officers, but that again was not good news for me.
Did you know that there was smoke logging in that single staircase?
I didn't know there was smoke logging at that point, but because of the scale of the fire spread, I'd already assumed that the lobby would have been compromised in some places. I was working on that assumption immediately.
Did anybody tell you that Adrian Fenton and Joe Smith at Brigade Control had been told that crews had been struggling to get above the 15th floor?
No, not at that point.
Right. Did you know anything about unsuccessful rescue attempts?
No, not at that point.
Can I ask you, in the minute or so we've got before 4:30, Mr. Chairman, to look at the PRC notes again, LFB quadruple 03112, and turn to page 1. You say in the middle of the page there, after brief from DAC, and this is under the part of the meeting which deals with what you were saying, wanted to ensure clear structure, major effort was rescue of savable life, I'd written building off.
Yeah.
And then you go on to say what you gave Andy O'Loughlin.
Yeah.
And then you say, I wasn't going to worry about NICS, NICS. It was beyond NICS, so dynamic. My question is, in forming those conclusions, how much were you relying on what you'd seen separately, and how much were you relying on what Andy O'Loughlin was telling you in his brief?
composite of the whole thing. So I think, again, if we go back to the decision-making model, what you're doing at that stage of an incident is you're gathering information from all available resources, and you're trying to build a picture of the incident based on those. So I'd seen the fire itself. I was sure internal compartmentation had failed to a significant extent. I had seen that we were committing crews into the building, so therefore I was thinking about the safety of crews and what it meant to carry out that operation. I knew, because of the time of day, because of the nature of the community, because of what I'd been told on Tom Goodall's unit, we had significant involvement of people inside, and all the information I'd gathered en route. Andy simply confirmed everything I knew. He didn't tell me anything particularly I didn't know, and therefore my priority was to get control as much as we could on that incident. Right. I think, if you wouldn't mind, I think my role is at the point I come, because I've had the benefit of not being involved, generally, I would say Grenfell's slightly different, in the horrendously dynamic stage of an incident. I've come with a bit of time and space already to have thought about it, and it's my job to relieve those officers who've been there for some time from the burden of trying to structure that incident and try and build on what they'd already done to bring some order to what are inherently chaotic situations, because I've generally got the support and the resources to do so. So that was my priority. I wanted to get onto that unit, relieve them of the burden of responsibility of being the incident commander, regardless of whether I've been briefed or not. I wanted to take that responsibility from Andy so that he didn't have to feel that in that way. And then I wanted to build a structure, because that is what my role was to try and put all the pieces in place that would allow us to resolve the incident.
Yeah. How will you go?
We have actually reached up fast four now.
Can I just ask this final question?
It's related. Yes, all right.
Otherwise, I'll have to ask it tomorrow morning.
Yes.
Okay. Just building on what you've just said to us and on the PRC notes, my question is, what method of saving rescuable lives in that building were you going to adopt?
Very simply, passing a combination of things. So passing information where we had specific information to crews. So if we knew where someone was in a flat, sending a crew to that flat, and then ensuring we had a volume of firefighters in breathing apparatus, generally undertaking a systemic sweep of that building over a period probably of hours, was my judgment, to clear any areas, whether we'd had any information or not. So it was two-pronged, really. You're working on the intelligence you have got specifically to individual flats, but also a general principle that at some point, every single floor and every single flat would have to be searched. Now, how long it would take us to get to that, I was unclear of at that point, because of the scale of what was facing it. I just knew that as an outcome, that would have to be the case, whether it was an hour later, whether it was 10 hours later, whether it was a day later. That was the principle we were going to operate to, that there would be no flat and no compartment left unsearched in that building.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Is that a convenient moment?
I think it is, Mr. Willett. Yes. Now, before we break, it was crossing my mind whether, having got slightly behind ourselves today, we needed to sit early tomorrow, but maybe we don't. I don't know.
Can I just say this? I think partly for Mr. Rowe's benefit, as well as everybody else's, and say, Mr. Rowe, forgive me while we have a bit of housekeeping. We did have a plan to have some other firefighters here tomorrow, namely Station Manager Davis, Watch Manager Ricketts, and Station Manager O'Neill. Group Manager O'Neill. Very helpfully, the LFB have agreed that we should postpone their evidence until Tuesday next week, because we are, I'm afraid, as is obvious, running a little bit behind this week, but it's very important that we get the incident commander's evidence in full, and they have a lot to tell us. And I've very consciously not been stopping people, telling them what they want to tell us. That means that the pressure on tomorrow is less, and if Assistant Commissioner Rowe doesn't mind coming back at 9:30, then there will be a clear route finishing tomorrow and covering Watch Manager Kentfield at the same time after Assistant Commissioner Rowe has finished his evidence. So the idea is, in a nutshell, start at 9:30, finish Mr. Rowe's evidence, and deal with Mr. Kentfield's, and then sit on Tuesday to finish the rest of the LFB witnesses that we were going to cover tomorrow but can't now.
All right, well, that's very helpful. Thank you very much.
And that would leave it clear, just to say, that would leave it absolutely clear for the Commissioner on Thursday.
Yes, well, I think I should record my gratitude to the LFB for making people available, often at very short notice and in a way which I suspect disrupts their schedules, but we are grateful for that. What I think that means for you, Mr. Rose, if you don't mind coming back, please, at 9:30 tomorrow. It's earlier than we usually start, but it means there's a good chance that we finish the evidence scheduled for tomorrow during the day, and then we'll certainly finish you, as I say, I hope the others as well.
Of course, sir.
Yes. So, thank you very much. You're free to go now, back at 9:30 tomorrow, and as I said earlier, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence overnight.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Rose, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, before you rise, and it doesn't matter.
Sorry, let
let
Mr.
the
Rose
witness withdraw
go.
first.
You go, Mr. Rose. Go with the usher.
This isn't for you.
No, yeah, we've got a perfectly reasonable step to take. Yes, Mr.
There are just a couple of things. I should have said that, of course, that was Tuesday is subject to final confirmation by the LFB, as I understand it. But certainly, as far as tomorrow is concerned, and Thursday, we are clear.
Yes.
It also means that Monday is I wouldn't say a day off, but it's a non-sitting day, as would be Friday. Mr. Chairman, there's just one other very small point of detail I need to correct from some evidence earlier on today that I think I asked DAC O'Loughlin about. I suggested to him that Hash Shamshun was from RBKC. For the record, I need to correct that that person is from the TMO, was from the TMO on the night, just so the record is clear.
Yeah. Good. Thank you very much. Right. Well, we'll break now and resume at 9:30 tomorrow then. Yes?
Yes. Thank you very much.
9:30 tomorrow, please.